agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a professor of political science at Northern Kentucky University. I'm joined today by my conservative counterpart, Cleveland area attorney Jay Carson.
Good morning, Mike.
Hey, Jay, how you doing?
I'm trying to get up the stairs, but I just keep slipping back down. It's one of those kind of mornings. So
yeah, I'm feeling sort of like a large ship stuck in the Suez Canal or something like that. But there we go. Anyway, we will get through it. But before we get started, I want to thank our newest supporters on Patreon, Chris, Donna, Charlie, and Corey. We really do appreciate it. And of course, when you're a Patreon supporter, you get that second full-length episode every week, our midweek episode, and also ad-free versions of all of our shows, as well as different stuff at different levels of support. To check it all out, go to patreon.com/politicsguys. And as always, if you'd like the bonus show, but you can't afford to financially support us right now, totally not a problem. We understand. Just send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will get you all set up. And if a monthly pledge is too much of a commitment, or you'd like to support us on a one-time or recurring basis, but don't want to go through Patreon, there's also our PayPal option, and you can find that at politicsguys.com/support. And we're also now on Venmo at politicsguys. All right. So, Jay, last week we talked about the tragic Georgia spa killings, and sadly, this week we have another mass shooting to talk about, this one in Boulder, Colorado, where 10 people were killed. The shooter has been identified as Ahmad al-Alibi al-Lisa, I hope I got that right, and he's currently in custody, of course, and being charged with 10 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted first-degree murder. And the weapon he used was a Ruger AR-556, which is essentially an AR-15 sort of cut down in the barrel and the stock to qualify as a pistol rather than a rifle, and he purchased that just 6 days before the shooting. I should mention that AR-15s, which are basically a semi-automatic version of the military's M16, have been used in a large number of mass shootings. It's kind of a popular weapon. It's got that military look, of course. It's very customizable, accurate, lightweight, low recoil, that sort of thing.
It's actually one of the best-selling guns, if not the best-selling gun, I think, in the United States.
Yeah, and so, it's not surprising that it shows up in a lot of these incidents. And in the wake of the shooting, President Biden called on the Senate to pass 2 background check bills that already have been approved by the House, and also for Congress to reenact an assault weapons ban. And, Jay, we've talked far too many times on this show over the years about mass shootings, and every time, it seems to me at least, that it's basically the same story. There's understandable and, righteous grief and outrage at the shooting. There are calls for legislative action from Democrats. There's strong resistance from any sort of legislative fix, mostly from Republicans. And then nothing happens. And then there's another mass shooting and we go through the same thing again. So I guess I won't assume that that's how you see it. But first off, I guess, do you see it that way? And if so, do you see that basic storyline changing this time?
No, I don't really. I mean, I think that is just sort of the storyline, and that's how it's gone since. I mean, I don't want to say mass shootings are just a recent phenomenon. They seem to be more prevalent than they were. Perhaps that might be reporting, but I mean, when you first started hearing of these sort of things back in the, I want to say 80s, 90s, maybe the first. Columbine being the first notorious, but so it's been that. So we're looking at 20 years essentially of this happening, and the 2 knee-jerk reactions is one is we need more gun control, and then there's the pushback on that, and then we sort of go away, and there's certain. And this is sort of a little grim and cynical, and I know you don't like me to be grim and cynical, but that's like I said, that's kind of my brand. Is there, to some extent, both sides get what they want, right? Which is they have an issue to campaign on, they have an issue to fundraise on, and so every time one of these tragedies comes out, you'll see, you'll get in the mail, at least I do, and you probably get them from the other side saying, please help us.
Yep.
Get rid of this. Please donate so we can stop these mass shootings. And then I get the letter saying, Biden's coming for your guns. Please, help stop him. And this kind of keeps playing out, and both sides are sort of satisfied because they have the issue to fight over, and sort of to rev up their base with. And to me, I think one of the bigger policy problems is with mass shootings. This is a problem that, in a lot of ways, I think defies most policy solutions, or at least we haven't come up with them yet. Right? If we would, they wouldn't keep happening, because we have plenty of checks on firearm sales and so forth. Has it made a difference? Well, maybe it's because it's always hard to determine deterrence, right? But certainly it hasn't eliminated the problem. And secondly, there's often a push to say, look, one of the bigger issues that we need to take a look at is mental health. And I think that played a role both in this, the Colorado shooting and the Georgia shooting. But that is something that's terribly difficult to get at from a public policy standpoint, and even from a medical public health standpoint. It's just not an easy problem to solve.
Yeah. Well, I guess
so. We fall back on sort of this other, response, the knee-jerk response.
Yeah, I guess I would say, that I think we do know what the policy solution is because we've seen a policy solution implemented in other countries. It's just we don't have the political will to do that. We have an awful lot of guns in this country. That's not going to change anytime soon. And there are ways to massive buyback programs, significant restrictions, but none of that's going to happen. That is sort of the cynical way. The cynical way to look at it is to say that we know what we can do to make our rates of gun violence in this country more in line with the rest of the world, but we're not willing to do that. That's the price we pay to have all these firearms because, other countries certainly, we're not unique in our levels of mental illness or anything like that, I don't think, but we have more.
I think we might be.
I don't think that's true.
I'd be interested in taking a look at that. But, and again, that's one of those, how do you measure it? I'm not sure that there's a good metric of, how you don't report on the census, hey, I'm mentally ill. But I'd push back on that in just that if the problem is just too many guns laying around and we ought to have buybacks and so forth, the Colorado shooter would seem to be an argument against that. And this is a guy who, as you said, bought his gun a week before he used it. He went through the appropriate background checks. He bought it legally, at least as far as we can tell at this point, right? Mm-hmm. There would have been no red flags in his past that would have disqualified him. He had a misdemeanor charge for assault, I think, when he was essentially still a minor. The whole regimen. Look, you can have a buyback, you can have background checks, you can have a waiting period. None of that would have affected the Colorado shooter.
Right. And now if there were, say, an assault weapons ban, maybe he would have bought something else. And I see what you're saying. And there are, potential bans or limitations on magazine capacity and other things. What I'm saying is that we can do things. There are things government can do that would make this sort of thing far less likely. But Americans in general do not believe those things are palatable. And that's a trade-off that we make. And I'm, I guess in a sense, I won't say I'm fine, but I appreciate the honesty of gun rights advocates who say, yes, our gun violence, our gun death rates are far higher than anyone else, but that's the price we pay for the right to have, the right to bear arms. And that's a logically defensible argument. I would, want to err more on the side of fewer gun deaths and more restrictions, but what really bugs me are these what I feel are intellectually dishonest arguments about, well, guns don't kill people or something like that kind of junk.
Well, let me step in because I on the one hand I think you did a pretty good job characterizing the position of the right, but I would put sort of a little gloss on it, and that is that in saying, look, we accept a certain level of violence in exchange for the right to own firearms. I would perhaps look at it the other way, that a lot of conservatives see the world as there's a certain amount of violence out there. Therefore, I need to have the right to own a firearm.
It becomes kind of a vicious circle there.
Well,
but yeah,
it does a little bit, but if you consider, look, if you look at it from the point of view as if you're a criminal, you are not going to follow whatever laws are out there. Now, it might be more difficult for you to get a gun. You might have to jump through more hoops to get it illegally, and maybe there you can weed out some folks there. But you're not going to stop it altogether.
No, of course not.
And I think that's then sort of the conservative response is listen. Well, there's two there are a couple different subsets of more than a couple of gun owners, I think, and their reasons for gun ownership. Some of them are purely recreational hunting, sporting, target shooting. Some are it's more a tradition, heritage based kind of, grandpa had a gun. I have we've always had guns. Some it is self-protection.
And some it's I'm very insecure of my masculinity, and so I want to have 37 guns.
Yeah, there's some of that. Some is the government's coming and so forth, and I have to be ready for them. But I think there is a sense in the conservative mind, right, that there is always a certain quantum of violence, of crazy out there. And there's an understanding that government can't stop it because that's just the nature of the world, right? It's
well,
sort of
let me just stop you there. But of course, when we look at the nature of the world in other countries, it's very different.
Yeah.
So maybe we're just are you saying sort of culturally maybe we're just a more violent people than than the Swedes or the Japanese or something like that?
Maybe. It's there are a lot of factors that go into that, right? And some of it's just the overall culture. For example, look, you can say China doesn't have a gun violence problem.
Yeah, I don't want to go quite that far. What China's doing, sure. No, I know what you're saying, and it's a matter. I want to be clear. I believe that the Second Amendment confers an individual right to bear arms. I think that the decision, the court, what was it, the Heller decision was correct.
Yeah, 2015.
2015, yeah, and I also, I've used firearms in the past, and I get the attraction. Certainly,
you're probably a much bigger firearm user than I am. Yeah, obviously,
I get my general position where I come down is I feel like it's not unreasonable for firearms to be regulated as rigorously as car ownership and driving. The same sort of standards. Yeah. I would be happy if the same sort of standards applied, and they don't, of course. But in terms of what actually will happen, I don't think anything's going to happen here. It seems to me, even though President Biden made those comments, there are really he's not pushing any legislative proposals. I think he's much more concerned with other things, voting rights, infrastructure, healthcare, that sort of thing. And I think it's just a decision of, well, what do you expend your political capital on? What's likely to happen? And this is a fight, I think, that President Biden feels that there just is not much chance of success, and it would take a lot of time and energy and effort, and so therefore let's not go there. And I think that's probably a reasonable political calculation to make.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely the correct, especially with the 50-50 Senate, right?
Exactly.
And if you consider there is more heterodoxy, I guess, in the Democratic Party on guns than there is on, say, something like abortion.
Yeah.
and you would risk losing, the Joe Manchins of the world and others um,
Yeah.
on any kind of real push on that.
So there we go.
When there's a lot of and I think so often you and I talk about these things and maybe we don't make it clear that, I mean, I guess in any administration and you have a finite amount of political capital to expend. And you have a finite amount of effort that you can put towards things, and you have to make choices about where you make those efforts. And if you're doing things like a 1.9 trillion rescue project and working on another $3 trillion you're just not going to be able to have that big ask. And one more thing, I want you to stick your neck out for me on a gun rights issue.
And as you point out, the votes just aren't there in the Senate. I don't even know the votes would be there in the House really, but they definitely aren't there in the Senate. So it's pointless to spend the time on something that just won't pass. So
and I would again go back to, I think there is a big argument to be had regarding gun violence and mental health and how that might be dealt with. And actually, I think you'd pick up some Republican votes there. That would probably come in the form of more money to mental health services. Now, again, does that necessarily solve the problem, fix the problem? I don't know, because, like I said, it's a hard problem to fix.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
absolutely. And I certainly, just in general, more money, more support for mental health services, I think would be a great thing in general. And sort of on a related note, last week, as I mentioned, we did a segment on the Georgia mass shootings, and it resulted in the most listener criticism we've gotten in a long time, maybe even ever. I was kind of surprised by that. There was this big back and forth about it
I was not.
I was, and I always check in on the Bipartisan Politics Reddit group, which it's great. I should put in a plug there. They do. That's the group that I started on Reddit, but then I turned it over to some other moderators, some people who do some great stuff. And every week, Mevred posts like these amazing show notes with comments and links and so forth. It's just really great. And this week there was a big discussion there on it, and we came in for a lot of criticism, and people really took issue with how we approached the story for a number of reasons. But it seemed to me that it boiled down to a few main things. First was a sense that we were minimizing the rise in AAPI intolerance, especially UJ, and that I wasn't pushing back hard enough on that. And related to that was the argument that we erred, I guess you could say, in making the focus of our discussion the media's attempt to fit something into a certain narrative, as opposed to the shootings themselves and the rise in racial intolerance, which we did talk about, but kind of after that. And so what do you think about that? I mean, I was surprised. Like I said, I actually went back and re-listened to the segment, but I wanted to get your take on that. You said you weren't surprised.
I was not surprised. No. And look, and I stand by everything I said last week. In fact, the reaction to me, I mean, makes sort of the point that I was trying to make. The media and our culture, but I'd say mostly the media and our politicians, does a severe disservice to our country when they lock themselves into this racial narrative. And I think that's what happened. And the idea that we're minimizing rising violence against Asians. I mean, let's look at what I said. I mean, I led off the show and did the show notes, and I said, listen, there has been documented at this point 150% increase. But I put in the caveat that, look, if you look at the actual numbers, they are minuscule, right? And again, for example, I know in Los Angeles, the number of anti-Asian hate crimes jumped from 7 to 15.
Right.
Nationally, I want to say that the numbers, and I don't have them in front of me, but it was something in the line of 49 to 120-ish or something like that in a country of 380 million.
The 327, I think. But yeah, still,
Yeah.
point taken. And this is where I feel like, when I listened to it again, I actually felt there was something to some of the critiques. I feel like I should have pushed harder on that, saying, well, that's true. These are reported hate crimes, but there are plenty of things almost certainly that don't rise to the level of hate crimes that constitute intolerance. And we did talk about that, but I feel like I didn't give that the emphasis that I should have. And I believe that was that was a mistake in terms of emphasis on my part.
But let's put it this way: why? I mean, and I think my sentiment was, is intolerance necessarily the government's business? Obviously, crimes are, hate crimes are, violence is. But secondly, I mean, if we are trying to make policy decisions or policy diagnoses, right, based on things that aren't reported, I mean, that's problematic, right? That's sort of, buying into that narrative, saying, okay, well, here's the numbers. Well, the numbers are probably wrong because the numbers don't fit the narrative.
Well, let me stop you there. It's not that the numbers are probably wrong because the numbers don't fit the narrative. It's that we're making a distinction between two different things. We don't have any numbers for intolerance.
Right.
We have numbers for reported hate crimes. But, somebody yelling out some ridiculous, horrible slur, that's not going to be a reported hate crime. But that certainly is unacceptable intolerance that, is a problem.
Right. But what evidence what I'm saying is where's the evidence for that other than just anecdotal?
You mean other than, say, the former president's rallies and comments and things like that? I mean, there's evidence.
Well, I don't think he ever hears it.
Well, no. I mean, he didn't go to
I'm saying as far as, people experience it, that, there is this fear that Asians are being targeted. I'm just, where is it? And again, if you even break down the actual crimes against Asians, in most cases, they seem to fit in line with overall increases in crime based on the neighborhoods, based on increases in crime that have occurred over the last year. Most related to COVID lockdowns, et cetera. Here's the other thing, and maybe I should. Best way I can explain it. My big issue, and let me back up one more time. The other piece, if you want to say intolerance is bad, is a problem, okay, agreed. But it's certainly different than mass shootings, right?
Oh, sure.
There are plenty of people who may have an intolerant attitude. They may be jerks. But does that necessarily follow that they are a danger, that they are killers in waiting? Right? There are plenty of people who have backwards, bigoted attitudes and prejudices. But I mean, are they a danger to society because of those? I would say no. Those people have lived among us for hundreds of years. And it's, what should the government concern itself primarily with is, well, actual issues where there are crimes. And again, going back to the facts of the Georgia shooting, I think that pinning this on a racial motive just doesn't make sense. I mean, is there a racial component? Perhaps, but the shooter didn't go into 3 Chinese restaurants, right?
Sure.
There was a specific target, and it was related to his sexual addiction. And I think that's what troubles me when the media says, "Oh, look, this is racist," and here is something else that may be happening that we can't quite quantify.
I hear you there, but I also think, and some people pointed out, say, well, why would we, here's somebody who just went and killed 8 people, and we should just assume that he's telling the truth about why he did that. Why would we necessarily just give this person the benefit of the doubt, believing that they're a person of great integrity and explaining their motives? And I think, maybe there's something to that. Maybe I was a little quick to say, well, the killer said that there wasn't a racial motive, so therefore there wasn't. And I'm not saying you're wrong here. I'm just saying maybe I I feel like in listening to the comments and re-listening to the segment that maybe I was a little quick to jump the other way on it to say, well, you know what I'm saying? Maybe I overreacted in that sense.
Well, let me again. I will. I'm standing my ground here.
Okay.
Why would he lie?
I don't know.
I mean,
He's clearly a disturbed person.
It seems just a very strange sort of thing of you're going to essentially confess to murdering 8 people, and they ask you why you did it, and then he makes up a different reason, saying he's a sex addict because look, he doesn't want the police to get the wrong idea about him.
I hear what you're saying.
To me, it just seems kind of goofy. And the other piece is, if we're looking at what evidence do we have, at that point, the best evidence we have is his actual statement.
Sure.
Right. And look, it's in the law what you would call a statement against interest, saying, look, I killed these people because of my I was concerned that they were essentially feeding my sex addiction. That's a pretty big statement against interest.
And don't get me wrong. I'm saying I think that, yes, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that. All I'm saying, and if I had a bet, I would say that, that more of the evidence is on that side. I'm just saying I was maybe too quick.
What's the evidence on the other side?
Well, the evidence on the other side is just the fact of the racial component in terms of the actual results. I mean, regardless of what the shooter's conscious intent was, we know that this was an act of violence perpetrated largely against Asians. I mean, that's just the fact.
There was at least one of the victims was Hispanic.
That's why I said largely against, not wholly against. And so,
but again, I mean, wouldn't that cut against if your motive is racial? I'm going to go out and kill Asian people because I hate them. Why do you also kill the Hispanic person?
Well, you're not necessarily doing this, with the
understood. Right. It's not.
I think sometimes during this discussion, maybe you're assuming a level of rationality on the part of this clearly disturbed person that maybe isn't necessarily warranted.
Right. No, not at all. I'm assuming, but what I'm assuming is there is a rationality that was ascribed to him by the media.
Sure. Yeah.
By saying, here's the motive.
Sure. Yeah.
This is what he went out to do. This is what, because there's no question about what he did.
Yeah.
It's the only question is motive. And he says, this is my motive. And the media ascribed a different motive, absent any real evidence, and even with evidence to the contrary. And that's my problem.
No, so, I hear what you're saying, and I understand you're standing your ground. And I'm saying that I don't necessarily, go back on anything I said. I just feel like I maybe jumped to that point. I didn't give those other right. considerations enough thought, maybe in that. But there was another concern, I guess you could say, and this just totally took me by surprise, and I'm embarrassed that it did. Maggie, one of our Patreon supporters, wrote in and said, why hadn't we discussed the shootings as a hate crime against women? And I thought, that's a really good point. And not only that, but we didn't even talk about issues involving the stigma against sex workers. And because that's clearly, he said that was
sure.
a motive. And
he said that's the motive. Yeah.
That totally wasn't part of our conversation. And I thought, wow, I missed that entirely. And in part, I don't feel like the media narrative was on that. And maybe, I feel like in that sense, if we were to discuss the story again, I would have talked a lot more about that. And that just totally passed me by. And, maybe it's because I'm a guy and I didn't think about it in those terms. I don't know, but I missed that.
Well, again, also several men were killed.
Yeah, so but pretty clearly, but wait a second. Now, if you're going to say that we need to go based on what the killer said, the killer clearly said that he was trying to kill these women because of his sex addiction, and he wanted to remove the temptation.
Kill these women because of his sex addiction. He
was having sex with the women
because of the sex addiction.
But it was to remove the temptation. So
yes.
It would be using the same logic that you used. Clearly then. The overwhelming weight of the evidence would suggest this is a crime against sex workers for being sex workers, against female sex workers in particular. And that was a huge component of it that we didn't even look at.
Yeah, no, and I think that's the much more rational reading of what happened. Let me say this, is I think there may be facts yet to come out.
Sure.
And for us to wade in on some of these issues might be premature on some of those facts. But I think there's something that's interesting that may be missing from the story, which again, to me, is a question the media hasn't answered or hasn't even asked. Most of the victims were, well, let's put it this way, none of the victims were young women. And I think that may be indicative of something. And I'm not sure what yet. I'm not sure we have all the facts yet.
I'm not really sure where you're going here with this.
Yeah,
but...
that's fine.
Okay.
But no, I don't want to speculate, right? But you could say if it was the sex workers who were actually providing sex, you would have expected to see more younger women as victims.
I think
you're
I think you're going far too trying to get far too much into this person's head and reasoning, and maybe reading too much into this.
That's what we're trying and being asked to do, right? I mean.
Well, yeah, they're to a certain extent, but then it's easy to go too far. Well, they were between the ages of, median age was 36.7 or something like that. Now, if it had been 21.4, I would, draw one. I think that's just kind of trying to do too much with what we have. Maybe.
Okay.
But
I guess my question is, were there any? Well, again, we just don't have the information, and again, that's why.
Sure.
My bigger problem is with the media of in the absence of information, what they did is insert the racial narrative.
Yeah. And just to be clear before we do move on, it's I think what we both agree on is that AAPI intolerance seems to be on the rise based on the information we have, and we both find that reprehensible. And
absolutely,
yeah. So there you go. All right.
I would even, Mike, I would even go so far as to say that Asian Americans are heavily discriminated against in things like college admissions.
That's another story. Yeah, in fact, there have been
some
the
Biden administration took a less sympathetic position to that than what I would. But actually, I'll tell you what. Can I, if you could indulge me for like 2 minutes, let me
sure.
Let me just this is, and then not on that issue, but because I think this is really important.
Okay, sure.
Into where I'm coming from and my view of the media and the racial narrative. So, growing up where I did in Youngstown, we lived in the suburbs, and there was the sense, the common sense that going downtown was quote unquote dangerous, right? There were bad areas. You don't want to go there, particularly if you're a white person. That was a racial narrative that really didn't have much basis in fact. There was a lot of violence in Youngstown in the late 80s, early 90s, a lot of it gang related, but the chance of someone, a visitor from the suburbs, being randomly attacked were slim. Yet that narrative persisted to the extent that no, people don't want to go downtown. There was a sort of urban legend. It was actually on our radio. Someone called in. This is talk radio, late 80s. That they'd heard that in order to get into a gang, the initiation was you had to cut off a finger of a white person, and that what these potential gang members were doing was they would lay underneath a car parked out at the mall in the suburbs. And when you approached the car, this was around Christmas time, that was December, they would slash your ankle, and then when you reach down to get your ankle, then they would slash off your finger and then take that and with that gain admittance to the gang of their choice. It was obviously ridiculous, right? But people believe this. It was like, oh, did you hear what they're doing at the mall? And this is a racial narrative, right? And what it did was it was saying, white people look out, the black people are out to get you. that narrative is one. It was completely fallacious. It was not based on any kind of fact. And two, it was damaging in that it heightened racism. It made people more afraid of others where they shouldn't be. And my concern is when you have the media that jumps into a void where they don't have any actual information and says, "Hey, look out!" Whether it's whatever minority group, whether it's Biden saying, you put you all back in chains, whether it was the every time you don't vote, a church burns, or if it's this narrative of people are going to shoot you because you're Asian because of something Trump said.
But see, that seems to me that's inverted.
That infects this. That's I mean, I think that's bad. And the media is putting these narratives out there in the absence of actual facts. And
I see what you're saying, and I agree, Jerome, but I think you've inverted it because on the one hand, with the example you gave, that the message there is don't prejudge Black people negatively. Don't have fear toward Black Americans because of this false narrative. But
right.
This is the reverse of that. This isn't about, concerns about people being afraid of Asians. This is about
No. What it's doing though is it's telling Asians you should be afraid of the rest of the country. And I think that is damaging. Whenever we tell one one racial group that you ought to be afraid of the other.
See, I don't think that's the message.
Racism.
I don't think that's the message at all. I think the message is don't hate on Asians because they're Asians, and I think that's a pretty healthy message.
Right. But implicit in that is that there is this hate against Asians that they need to be afraid of, and I think that's a problem. When you don't have the hard evidence to try to
see,
really,
I see what you're saying.
Or you try to take something like the Georgia shooting and put it into that racial narrative. That to me is the big problem.
But here's I think where a lot of listeners took issue, particularly with you and for me for not pushing back hard enough on that, is that may be true, but it's easy then for people to use that to minimize the real problems that are out there. And this wouldn't be something you would do, but you're not a racial hatred person in the first place. But it's go ahead. I'm sorry. You're not going to dispute me on that, certainly. And so I think that's the issue, because this is a real thing. And maybe it is being emphasized to a degree that you find to be not in line with the available evidence. But if we are going to err, which way should we err? And I think it's a good idea to err on the side of emphasizing issues of racial hatred as opposed to not emphasizing them enough.
Well, then, look, and what about, though, if you look at crime statistics, if you say that Black on white crime is much more common than white on Black crime. I mean, those are just the numbers, right? Should we view this as an epidemic of should white people be afraid of Black people? Of course not. But that's that would be the same if you were to transfer that same message to say, listen, here are these numbers. Therefore, there must be evidence of racial hatred. That's my problem, is when you get into making that the narrative. It's bad for everyone, and again, eclipses often what is actually going on.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, and again, I feel like in so many instances, if people were rational and generally good-hearted the way you are, that wouldn't be an issue. But that's just not the case, and so I think you're making the error of assuming that people think and view the world in much the way that you do, and that's just not the case. That's kind of my take on it.
Okay.
All right. Well, before we move on to our next story, we need to take just a quick break, and then we'll be back to talk about President Biden's first ever as president news conference. Okay, so in his first ever news conference as president, Joe Biden, well, he was asked to comment on a number of things, but as you would expect, right? I mean, he said...
That's kind of the point.
That's kind of how it works. Yeah, who knows what's going to come up? And, he said things like, well, he thought he maybe would run again in 2024. He said his administration was doing everything it could to treat people humanely at the border. They said that he couldn't imagine U.S. forces in Afghanistan after the end of the year, a lot of stuff. But what stood out to me really was voting rights. And maybe that's my own bias, because I believe that this is, or at least it should be, a core issue in any democracy. And the president harshly criticized Republican voting legislation currently in the works in many states, saying that this makes Jim Crow look like Jim Eagle. It's kind of a weird analogy. But anyway, I mean, this is gigantic what they're trying to do, and it cannot be sustained. And in response to this, President Biden pledged to do everything in his power to pass federal legislation on voting rights. He said that the filibuster, under which I'm sure, Jay, you would agree that Republicans would almost certainly block any significant voting rights legislation, Biden said it was being abused in a gigantic way. And once again, he indicated support for modifying it and possibly even going further than that if, in his words, there's complete lockdown and chaos as a consequence of the filibuster. So, Jay, we know that
didn't take long.
No, well, we know that a number of Republican-controlled states are set to pass more restrictive voting laws. In fact, Georgia this week led the way. They passed a law that, among other things, required more stringent voter verification for absentee ballots, reduced the time at which voters can request an absentee ballot, limited drop boxes, and even criminalized offering food or water to people stuck in long voting lines.
I would push back on that. I think that's not what the bill did. But
it was a misdemeanor.
Yeah,
I mean, it was not a felony, but it was.
That is just like Jim Crow.
But, it also removed the Secretary of State from serving as chair of the State Board of Elections, gives the legislature authority to appoint a majority of the members on that board, and authorized the state board to suspend local election officials under basically is more legislative control of the election process. And
it's almost like allowing the states to run their own elections.
It's almost like allowing the legislature to step in and nullify or to change the results of elections they don't like. I think that's what we're arguing on the left, is that giving these legislatures the power to control these state election boards in this very direct way, that basically allows these legislatures to have oversight over elections in which they themselves may be running, which is a clear conflict of interest in my view, and in the view of plenty of people on the left.
Well, all right, fair enough. But how does this get to this is just like Jim Crow? Or more like Jim Crow than whoever Jim the other guy was.
Well, and that I would say is hyperbole, because if you look back at Jim Crow laws, absolutely much worse than what we're seeing now. But we're looking at the direction that things are going in, and the direction is pretty clearly voter suppression, making it more difficult to vote. I mean, there's a very clear trend.
Let's go back a ways. So, Mike, when you and I were growing up, it used to be that you could only vote absentee. And again, this is in Ohio. I can't speak to other states, but I think other states were probably similar. We first started absentee voting sometime, I want to say, probably in the 80s. And the gist was, look, if you were over 65, I think, or were otherwise going to be absent from the county, you could register for an absentee ballot. And continued that way up through probably about the 90s or so when it got expanded again. Were we living in this repressive society and not even knowing it?
Well,
I mean, that to me that's what strikes me is this is the way we voted for years. These are the same election laws that were in place that were Democratic majorities were elected in the 80s and the 90s. And yet now it's Jim Crow. Now it's a hate crime to essentially say, look, we're going to limit the amount of time for you to request an absentee ballot to it's down to something like how many weeks or months before the election. And that's to me that it just
if you're going to make
this strikes me as the kind of hyperbole that is. Again, they're going to have you all back in chains.
Hold on,
really difficult to deal with.
When Donald Trump was president, You seem to have a lot less trouble with hyperbole, saying that, well, you have to take him seriously, but not literally. And so
Right.
is hyperbole okay for Donald Trump, but not okay for Joe Biden? Or what's the deal here?
Well, I think so. I mean, you take
Oh,
no. I mean, I should say I would
okay.
say look, the hyperbole is not helpful in either case. Um, but if you've got look, I will condemn the hyperbole across the board.
Now you
If
will.
you want to point out, and I think I was good on that, and with Trump that you take him perhaps seriously but not literally. The problem with Joe Biden is I am taking him seriously, right?
Well, yeah, but I don't
Um,
understand. So don't take him literally. Take him seriously. So when he says this makes Jim Crow look like Jim Eagle, just take that
Jim Eagle.
seriously, but not literally, because I don't even know what it would mean to take it literally, because I don't know who Jim Eagle is. But the
Right.
point being is that he's saying things. This is not good. That's what he means by that. And I certainly agree with that. You disagree with that because things were just fine when we were growing up, seems to be the logic. I would say, well, if we want to go back to those rules, that's fine. Then let's go back to the rules that required that states with a history of racial discrimination go back to pre-clearance with the Justice Department before they can change their voting laws. I'd be okay with that.
I'm not sure how the two follow, but
But I'm saying you were making some sort of a history tradition related thing. So things seemed to be fine when we were growing up, and
right.
so, well,
No,
I'm
I mean
saying, well,
I'm making the argument that look, the right now everyone's saying, oh, our voting processes, that this is terribly unfair. Republicans are stealing your vote. They're disenfranchising you by doing X, Y, and Z. Where this has been the way we voted as a country for years and years and years, and no one complained about it.
oh, people were
No one
complaining
seemed.
about it. I mean,
Pardon?
people were complaining about it. It's just that those complaints weren't listened to. We can go back, 30, 40, 50 years, and there were plenty of people who had all kinds of problems voting, and just their complaints fell on deaf ears.
Well, all right. Let me ask you. Let me ask it this way. Uh, do you think having to same day registration, for example, that's something that a lot of states have wanted to get rid of? Um, is that the civil rights issue um, for the 2020s? Why can't we put a limit saying no? You can't just register to vote and vote the same day. There ought to be a some sort of period to verify you are who you say you are and you live where you say you live.
Well, I think and this is where we differ. I would say is that the assumption should be, or the bias should be toward having as few hurdles as possible to allow people to vote, so long as we can ensure that voting is done safely and securely. And we have enough evidence now to know that same day registration absolutely can work in a safe and secure manner. Plenty of states do it. And so, therefore, I would say that we should move in that direction. It's always better, other things being equal, to move in the direction that allows people to more easily express their views in the most fundamental way in a democracy, which is through voting. And there should be a damn good reason for any sort of measures that make that more difficult. And it can't be the former president screaming about conspiracies that didn't exist. That's not
All
good
right,
enough.
let me put it to you this way. And this is so often when we get into these voting rights issues and how easy or difficult it should be to vote or not vote. First of all, I mean, do you think voting is difficult as it stands right now?
Not for me, but that's not the problem. So for me, it's pretty easy, but there are plenty of people for who it can be difficult. Yeah, absolutely.
What are those difficulties? Why is it difficult?
Getting to the polls, getting an absentee ballot, having the right form of ID that would be accepted. Those are the three things that come to mind right away.
So, and again, polls are, for the most part, spread out into places where people live, right? They're in the neighborhoods. They're divided into precincts, into wards.
Yeah, but we know
And
that.
people, let's put it this way, people have always been able to get there beforehand. Now,
No, they
in
haven't.
a
And
lot of
that's
states,
not true.
absentee voting is, Ohio, for example, and again, I'll speak to that because I know more about that than I do other states, has for, I want to say, 10, 15 years, had a, no questions absentee voting. If you want an absentee ballot, you ask for one, you get one. And I think the timing on it is something in the neighborhood of at least has to be a week or so before the election, because that way they can get it back in time for the election, which is sort of
Sure.
became an
Yeah.
issue in some, right? And to me, that, I mean, do you see something like that as being a limitation on voting?
No, I think that's a good thing. I think that's reasonable. I don't have a problem with Ohio's absentee ballot laws.
So what if I said you same day registration, no questions, absentee? I walk in, I register, and I say, today's election day. I'd like to register to vote. Okay, and I'd like an absentee ballot.
Wait, I guess I don't understand why you would go somewhere and.
Because I got to get to work. I don't have time for this. I don't have time to vote and register and vote the same day. Jesus.
Well, I would say that.
Let me register. Give me the ballot. I'll send it in.
Well, I guess I would say that if you can get it sent in before the deadline to send in ballots, then sure. But I don't think
I can't control when the post office does stuff. Come on, man.
Well, then, I mean, I see what you're saying. There need to be limitations. It can't be like, well, I forgot to send this in, and it's a week after the election, but you should still count it. No, I think that there can be reasonable, and there have to be reasonable limitations. I, for instance, don't have at all a problem saying that every single ballot needs to be in by election day. That seems reasonable to me, and it seems reasonable to me to say to people, hey, understand that the Postal Service takes a certain amount of time. We'll talk about this probably on our bonus show. And so if you mail your ballot in on election day, it's not going to get there in time. So sure, I think that's a reasonable restriction.
So let's put it this way.
I'm not for open ballots, and not even for open borders. But yeah.
Well, I mean, all right. So this is the other piece that you and I offer different on is the idea of voter fraud, and you say, well, there's hardly ever any proof of it, and I say, well, it's because nobody ever checks it or prosecutes it. And look, I'm starting. Let me be clear, as I have been in like a zillion shows in the past. I don't believe that there's massive voter fraud. I don't believe that the election was stolen. I don't believe, but I do believe that there are shenanigans at every election.
Sure.
I can't tell you. I mean, I've worked in so many campaigns, so many elections.
And I agree with you about this,
There's always
Jay.
stuff that happens.
I will stipulate to this. I mean, we've talked about this before.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I would say that even though pretty much any study serious study that's been done about this finds, very almost no, like infinitesimally small amounts of clear voter fraud. You're right. I can't see how you couldn't be right that what goes on and isn't detected will have to be greater than what goes on and is detected. And so I don't disagree with you there. I think we probably are pretty close on that. What I'm saying, and I think what a lot of people on the left are saying, I would hope, is that we need to weigh the security, the amount of fraud that might be actually happening, even if it's higher than, what the statistics show, against making it, and I understand your reluctance to use the word disenfranchisement, but making it more difficult for people to vote to the extent that fewer people vote. So maybe that's not.
Has that been an issue, though?
Yeah,
I mean,
it
in
absolutely
our
has
last
been.
election, again, we've had record turnouts.
Yeah,
turnouts have been going up.
We had record turnouts in the last election, and that's of course because of the nature of the election. But I think it's a mistake to just say, well, there's not a problem here, given the fact that this isn't just anecdotal. We know that there are plenty of places where, for instance, people have to wait in line for hours to vote, and that's not okay. I don't think you think that's okay.
No, I don't think that's okay. But again, that's not the type of voting reforms that we're necessarily talking about, right? To me, that seems to be bad local management of resources. And you would make the argument that maybe you need more resources committed to the locals, and you may be right. I mean, to me, like one other analogy here.
Sure.
So, for example, bank robberies are fairly rare. And the reason they're fairly rare is, well, because we have all kinds of security. You have a guard there. You have cameras. You have, the silent alarms. You have the bags that blow up with the ink on them. Yeah, all these things, right? Um, and if you say, well, look, do we really need this because these crimes are fairly rare? Let's get rid of the cameras. Let's get rid of the guards. Let's get rid of the ink bag thing.
I like this analogy. I do. I think it's a great analogy, and I completely agree with it. And
at some point you're going to say, no, bank robberies will increase. We say right now we don't have much fraud because of X, Y, and Z. But if we remove precautions, if we make it easy to say, look, I'm going to go to one ward or one precinct, register, go to another vote, go to another register vote, go to another register vote, and do that. And look, by the time they catch on to it, I've voted several times. Then you get to the count all the votes.
Let me stop you here because, okay, let's go with that analogy. I like the analogy, but what so many Republican legislatures are doing is basically, we have this security in place and bank robberies are very, very rare. But so now let's have everyone walk through a metal detector. Let's have everyone have a pat down before they go into the bank. I mean, we are seeing these restrictions, these greater restrictions being pushed in state legislature after state legislature after what the Trump administration's own officials said was one of the safest, most well-conducted elections in our history. So that it would be like the bank saying, well, let's have more security, even though we haven't had a bank robbery. I mean, it doesn't. So your analogy works, and maybe it's an argument against loosening restrictions, but it's certainly not an argument for what Georgia and a lot of other state legislatures are doing.
I would just point out that some of the things that maybe to continue the analogy is the bank does have to keep up with what the potential robbers might be doing. So for example, okay, before they had you got the cameras, you got the guards, you got the ink bag thing, but you know what? The bank is now doing a whole lot more cybersecurity than it did 10 years ago because criminals are taking a different tack. There's a different weakness that they're exploiting, and that's electronically. So we're going to have this cyber thing. I would use that analogy instead of the metal detector. But I get what you're saying. My point is that because the way we are voting now has changed from the way we were voting 20 years ago, the ability to cheat around the edges has changed also.
And you think it's just coincidental that in all of these Republican-controlled states that they happen to be doing this? I mean, it's just because it's a concern with security.
Not at all. But I think in the Democratic-controlled states, they're they don't care. They're not in favor of this because I think on the margins they see this as one. It's a good political issue because they can tell a minority community, I think quite wrongfully, that you are being discriminated against, that people are trying to steal your votes, that this is just like Jim Crow. And second, I think they believe, and again, I think often wrongfully, that greater participation leads to greater Democrat electoral victories. And I don't know that bears it out, but either way, that's.
Yeah. We need to just take one more quick break, and we want to continue on with this after that, talking about, I think, the prospects for any sort of change. Maybe the filibuster. Joe Manchin, I think, will come up, and my view on the great favor that maybe Donald Trump has done for the Democratic Party. And we'll be back with that in just 1 minute. Okay, Jay, so we're back. And, I wanted to move the conversation, I guess, onto what we think might happen in terms of voting rights, because my sense of things is that we are going to see some legislation. I mean, I know that Joe Manchin has come out saying that he is not in favor of the For the People Act. He believes that it goes too far.
Against the people.
Yeah, but it's a great name for an act, by the way. But I think what's going to happen is Manchin will be willing to sign on to something that's less widespread, I guess, less far-reaching than the For the People Act. And so what I see happening and what I predict will happen by the end of this year is that the Senate will put together a modified version of that that's far, again, far less sweeping in its legislative intent, which will get the support of Manchin and Sinema and the kind of the centrist group of Democrats there. And that will also give them enough support in the face of, well, I'm sure will be uniform Republican opposition to put in some sort of change to the filibuster rule. Maybe it will be just for voting rights legislation. I'm not sure, but I expect to see something on voting rights change, some major legislation this year, and again, some sort of exception or modification of the filibuster rule. I would be surprised if that doesn't happen this year. What do you think?
Well, I would say that that does go against both your and my predictions from just 3 months ago on the filibuster, right? As I remember, we both said that we didn't think it would be changed. I don't think if it is changed, I don't think it's going to be a narrow just voting rights thing, because I think if you're going to do it, they're going to do it.
No, I don't think so. We'll see.
So
yeah.
we'll see. No, but I think, to me, if you're going to do that heavy political lift, you don't want to have to do it a couple different times.
Well, and the reason I say the reason I push back so strong on that is because, Manchin has made it really clear. He says he will not vote to eliminate the filibuster. And he said that enough times and strongly enough where I just don't see there's any way that that's going to happen. There aren't going to be the votes for that. So it won't be an elimination of it, because he won't be able to do that, assuming that that's what he, it's not just a political thing, but that's what he means. And so it just won't happen.
It may go with your version, which Biden seemed to sort of endorse, and Manchin has sort of endorsed, that go back to the Jimmy Stewart sort of speaking filibuster.
Right. It's going to be something that will allow, or that will make it far more difficult to hold up legislation. So but it won't. But what I'm saying is that, and this is what we talked about earlier, there won't be just a flat out elimination of the filibuster. That's not going to happen.
I would think you're probably right at this point. On that.
But do you expect it will actually be modified in some way? What do you think about my prediction?
I do.
And what about the voting rights stuff? Do you think that something...
I think there will be a slimmed down voting rights bill, because it's something else that we didn't talk about in the last segment, because it was more just the philosophy of these things. But the nuts and bolts of it, I think, are proving problematic. From what I read, there are plenty of state and local elections officials who look at this and say, this is just going to be a mess. It's going to be a headache. Just in terms of making these changes and then administratively working them out, it's going to be really difficult. So I think there will be some pushback as this moves through the Senate, where folks might just say, look, this might sound good in theory, but in practice is just going to prove really difficult. I agree. I've
read through the For the People Act. There's a lot there, and I think there's really too much. And I'd certainly like to see a somewhat slimmed down version of it. But I think that's the case. And the other thing I wanted to mention is, redistricting, of course, is a huge part of this, because we just had the census, and we're going to start to see redistricting, and that's part of the For the People Act, the independent boards, that sort of thing. And Jay, as you know, Ohio
which a lot of states already have.
Some states already have, though in the majority of states, it's still the state legislature controls that sort of thing. And I'm betting that certainly will be a big part. I would be surprised if that were taken. I think the things that will be taken out would be like the matching fund sort of thing, and some of the other voting provisions. But I bet in what ends up being passed, there will be some sort of gerrymandering commission sort of thing, because I think that's going to be seen as so critical in this year.
I think it wouldn't surprise me if some kind of commission. I'm not sure what exactly they're going to do or what actual power they'd have, but I think there will be good lip service for it.
And that doesn't necessarily have to be and that's obviously the idea is that's not a partisan sort of thing. And I think maybe, to me, the best sense.
Yes and no. It depends on how they write it, right?
Sure.
The extent that this is a board that gives advice and sets out parameters, and here's the way it ought to look, and that kind of thing. It's fine. To the extent it is something that encroaches on state sovereignty, to district their own electoral districts, then it's something else.
Well, and just to be clear, there really is no state sovereignty here. The Constitution allows Congress to pass whatever laws it wants here on this. So this isn't a federalism
But the Constitution also allows states to set up their own procedures for voting, and states have set up their own procedures for districting.
But what I'm saying is that Congress could pass essentially whatever kind of federalization legislation it wants on voting.
Congress can preempt.
Yes, exactly. And that would not be.
Yes.
That gets into we talk about this a lot on the show, that there are things that are unconstitutional that you may think are wise or unwise, but it would be incorrect to say that Congress passing whatever kind of voting rights or voting procedures legislation is unconstitutional, because that's not really the case. Okay. And, also I think, and this is, I hinted at this before the break, is that I feel like in a sense, Donald Trump might be inadvertently a big friend of the Democratic Party, because it occurred to me that, for one thing, had he not done what he had done in the wake of the election, we probably wouldn't have a 50-50 Senate, right? There'd be 51, maybe even 52 Republicans here. Yeah. And I really think that Donald Trump has sort of given the Democrats an opportunity that they would be, to kind of not to help the Democratic Party. I mean, I certainly don't look at it that way. I look at it in expanding voting rights, and certainly not what Donald Trump intended, but it sounded like you kind of agree with me on that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think Donald Trump put his own interests well ahead of the party.
There's a shock.
And which, that there were, I think, disastrous results in Georgia because of it.
Yeah. And, to me,
not even own interests. I mean, that's not even the right word.
His ego, his
own vanity.
Yeah. I think you're right. And, to me, that one of maybe the best sense that something will actually happen here is Mitch McConnell is starting to sound increasingly desperate on this issue. And I think he maybe recognizes that this is gonna happen, but we will see. One final thing I wanted to ask you about, Jay, is just the importance of news conferences in general. A few weeks ago on the show, Trey and Ken were talking about this, and according to Biden advisors, the plan was always to delay his first news conference until after the stimulus package had passed, so he could kind of do this as part of kind of a victory lap tour sort of thing. But then there are others who claim that, well, Biden's being very carefully managed by, presidential handlers due to, history of verbal gaffes, which is obvious, or of more concern, some people on the right say, well, diminishing cognitive abilities. And Ken and Trey focused on this specifically, and Ken actually had an interesting argument. He said, to him, it didn't even necessarily matter all that much if the president didn't have the mental stamina now that he had 10, 20 years ago, as long as he selects kind of the, really good people to run things. And I wanted to get your take on, just in general, the importance of these news conferences, and if it really matters if Joe Biden is getting out in front of the press and answering questions.
I think it matters a little bit. Right. And I think it matters more when you're 87 years old than if you're 57 years old.
Sure.
Because the story isn't that, hey, why aren't we hearing from Joe Biden? Or the story isn't, hey, boy, we really need an update on this or that. The story is, it looks like he's being hidden. And this is, of course, would be of a piece with the campaign. Now, in the campaign, you could say, look, it was COVID and so forth, so people weren't doing events, and that was a safety thing, and there was also political messaging that. Fair enough, but I do think when you are 87 years old,
78,
78.
Yeah.
I'm sorry,
big difference.
Did I say 87 both times?
Yeah.
Yes. Well, he just strikes me that way. No, anyway.
Well, let's hope he's not.
Regardless of a maturity of Joe Biden. And he has had gaffes even in his good days. Recently forgot the Secretary of Defense's name and said that he's the guy who runs that outfit down the street. Now, again, there before the grace of God go I, right? I mean, I have plenty of times where I forget somebody's name or misspeak or just, freeze. So certainly it can happen to a president who's got a lot on his mind. But I think that the issue there is if you have someone who's before the media and, every day and every couple days they'll mess up a name or something, well, that's one thing. If you have somebody who you never see, who makes gaffes and then you never see, there's a different sort of presumption there. So, do I think presidents need to be holding news conferences all the time? No. But I do think when there are issues of these issues out there, that the president owes some sort of reassurance to the country that he's capable.
Yeah, that seems pretty reasonable to me. I think that's more or less my take on that as well. I mean, it seems to me that certainly there is a narrative, not what I would say on the mainstream right, but kind of further on the right. Well, this guy is mentally in decline, that sort of thing. Just like I think there was during the Trump presidency, right? A narrative on the further parts of the left that Donald Trump was mentally ill.
Right. It wasn't even the further parts of the left. I would say that
well, I mean, certainly we'll say on the left.
I
think, yeah. And so I think it's easy to read too much into that, and sometimes I think it's sort of wishful thinking, because anyone who says things that you don't agree with, you'd like to believe is mentally unstable or losing their marbles or something like that. And but yeah, I think that. So I don't take as strong a position as Ken on that. I do think that it's important for the president every once in a while to get out there and answer questions in front of the media, not just to demonstrate that he is compos mentis, but because to show that, I think it's just part of being a president in the democratic system, to face the press, to be out there and to take whatever questions. And I think that's an important thing. But Like you said, not every day, not every week, but I would say it seems to me once a month is reasonable, or something like that. So there you go. All right. Well, we have gone a little bit long. So with that, we will wrap things up for today. But before we do, I just want to remind everyone that as soon as we are done, we will be recording our midweek bonus episode for our Patreon supporters. And on that, we'll be talking about a Supreme Court ruling about excessive force and the Fourth Amendment. Help me out here. Unreasonable search and seizure provision. It's really kind of an interesting case.
Being shot.
Exactly. That's kind of cool.
I've been seized.
Yeah. Well, yeah. We will talk about that, and also some big changes, perhaps, in the works at the Postal Service, and a lot of Democrats up in arms about Postmaster General DeJoy on that, and maybe a little bit more, seeing how much time we have, but all of that will be there on Wednesday morning for you if you are a Patreon supporter. And if you aren't one and you'd like to be, just go to patreon.com/politicsguys. And again, as always, if you would like that and you're just not in a financial position to be able to support the show right now, send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will get you set up. If you're not already a subscriber to the show, it would really help us if you did that, as well as leaving ratings and reviews, and especially if you'd share your favorite episodes on social media. If you want to get in touch with us for any reason, we're at mail@politicsguys.com. We're also on Facebook and Twitter, and you will find those links in our show notes. Special thanks to our executive producers, Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Andra Masker, Daniel Toe, Chris Wilkerson, and Nathan Sosnowski. We'll be back with a new show next week. We hope to join us.